right, well, leaders, welcome back as we jump into lesson 2, Exodus chapter 2 to chapter 4. Frankly, it's probably one of my favorite sections of the book as we kind of get to look at Moses and his backstory and his kind of emergence and development as a leader that God's going to select. So as we jump into this section, we're going to kind of have some skills that are going to feel a little bit like middle school English class again. So if you had scars from that phase of life, I'm sorry, but we will try not to trigger them too much. But I want to kind of draw your attention to the observation section. And so one of the things that Carolyn and I really liked about this section is not just that it introduces kind of setting with all the key details related to people, places, times, but we think it's also kind of an easy table to kind of get everyone into the flow of Bible study. So we kind of said this last week. Sometimes it's just hard to get people talking, especially maybe some that are a little bit more shy or insecure about Bible study. And so one of the things we would just suggest is, like, even in our video, we're not going to go through the answers to the table. I think it's pretty basic, but one of the things that would be really good to think about doing is maybe pairing people up in your group and giving them each a section. Let them kind of work through the table, assuming maybe there are some people who haven't done any work coming into the group. And so they're like, where are we? What chapter are we on? Are we still on chapter 1? And so it kind of gets them kind of in the flow. Let them kind of work through with the setting, the characters, the plot summary, and then let them report back in. And so it kind of gets everyone talking, gives everyone kind of their sleeves rolled up and into the study. And so by the time then you would kind of get to the next section, everyone's kind of got their arms around these 3 kind of key chapters, kind of an easy way to get rolling and an easy way to get started.
Yeah, so good. You'll notice then that the skill in the observation over here is character description. So, of course, all through this great book, we're going to be meeting lots of people. And in this section, for sure, we're meeting a lot in Moses's family. I noticed, like, as I was writing out my characters, I'm like, wow, this is all of Moses's family introduced in this section. So one of the things that you can do then is to learn to kind of identify what type of character all of these people are. And these, again, as Trey said, you might have remembered from your English literature days. But what these descriptions do is they sort of help identify, at least in this scene, what type of action this character is doing. And so we have our protagonists, antagonists, agents, foils. So as we kind of talked it through, a way that you might want to discuss this is just say, hey, who were some of the protagonists that you saw in this section? And when Trey and I were talking before, we both, of course, said Moses, but God is also a protagonist in this section. Some of the antagonists are Pharaoh himself. Now, flat and round characters, we are a little bit of a description of a type of character. So, for instance, Moses is a round character. He's got strengths and he's got weaknesses. Pharaoh is an antagonist, but he is sort of a flat antagonist. He is sort of a one-dimensional, just all evil, all opposed to God. So as you talk about the characters, let your group kind of discuss. There's no one right answer, probably. It's just a way to begin to think about these people and the function that they're playing in the scene. So who were some of the agents that you saw?
Yeah, I thought the Hebrew witnesses that witness Moses' murder are an agent. They're not really that key of a character, but they're kind of just helping move it along. Probably the character type that I think is the most fascinating for narrative is the foil. And so you kind of get these characters that you're like, why are they there? But they're really kind of primarily there to cast a light on how different another character is or should be. So, I was thinking particularly of, you clearly have Pharaoh's daughter who's going to see Moses in the Nile and going to pluck him out of the water. And it's not just ironic that she's within Pharaoh's own family, and even in his own family, the people aren't obeying his edict. And so you kind of get this foil. And so it's someone who's incredibly close to Pharaoh, but is really set in contrast to the motives and the actions of Pharaoh himself. I also thought, in as you kind of get into the story, as Moses escapes after the murder that he witnesses, or that he's a part of, that ultimately the daughters of Jethro are going out, and there are shepherds who should be protecting flocks. They don't. Moses will come and protect the flocks. And so you get this real juxtaposition or contrast between Moses and these other nameless shepherds who are, again, a foil. They're nameless versus the named Moses. There's one that will have notoriety and one that will have, in a sense, they'll be infamous in the wrong way.
Yeah. There is a character here that actually has 2 names, and this could be a little confusing. So actually, Moses' father-in-law is named in two different ways. So you'll see him first in chapter 2, verse 18 as Ruel. Think that's how you pronounce that. But then in chapter 3, verse 1, his name is Jethro. So that's actually two names for the same character. And Ruel actually means friend of God. So El is a word for God. And so that maybe keep that in your back pocket. That might be significant. But if someone in your group is asking, hey, are there two people here? What is going on? That's more about that character.
And don't be embarrassed if you got confused. It tripped me up. I thought Ruel was a place by the end of time of my study. And so I was like, I'm so confused. And so Carolyn helped straighten me out. So obviously, too, one of the things we love to do as we kind of jump into a new lesson is what are the big ideas and themes? And particularly it helps, especially as we're walking through these big, long sections, to kind of have a moment to kind of synthesize back. What are just the big ideas? I'm getting lost in all the details and the settings and the plots. And so what are some of the big ideas? And so for me, a couple of the ones that kind of screamed out to me were, in a sense, God's preservation of Moses and God's preparation of Moses. And so there's a lot of details that kind of fall under that. But kind of how did you kind of see the big themes or big ideas?
Yeah. So a big theme that I saw was rescue. You see, of course, right away, baby Moses being rescued from death. We see Moses as a young man. He's attempting to rescue his fellow Hebrew, and he ends up killing the Egyptian. And then we see God just beginning his rescue plan, initiating with Moses, calling him out to rescue the whole people of Israel. And then at the very end, we see Zipporah, Moses' wife, circumcising their son so that Moses is rescued from death. So there's a lot of rescue happening, which of course is a big in this section, which is a big theme of the entire book. The other thing I thought that was interesting was what we see in the person of Moses is just another one of the people that God calls and chooses out as a representative to partner with him in accomplishing his will in that part of history. So this is God's MO. This is what he does. He calls human representatives to partner with him to push his plan forward. He did it with Adam and Eve. We see him doing it with Noah. We see him doing it with Abraham. And now as we get to Exodus, we see him doing it with Moses. So I saw that pattern.
And part of that plan, it seems to be the fulfillment of promises God made to Abraham. So it just reminds you kind of what we covered last week of so much of what you're seeing repeated in this backstory here is in these opening chapters is this sense that God is all about fulfilling promises to the nation of Israel that's been enslaved for 400 years. And God hasn't brought fulfillment to it, but he's going to continue to work now through Moses as that representative to help bring fulfillment to those promises that were extended, but not yet fulfilled. The other thing that kind of I saw as a big theme or idea, I wrote it out, I boxed it, and then I remembered later as I turned the page, it sets up our next question. But one of the things I just kind of screamed out at me as I was just thinking more synthetically through the characters is the women really stand out in these opening chapters. And so we got murders and Pharaoh and all these protagonists and antagonists. And then there's just a litany of women throughout here. And that really kind of sets up our first question interpretation on the next page. And so we asked, what is ironic about who God uses to rescue the life of Moses? And why is that significant? And so as you're kind of walking through these opening chapters, you have different women showing up throughout that have really vital and huge roles. And so it kind of starts with the Hebrew midwives. So Pharaoh, this is in chapter 1, Pharaoh, if you'll remember from last week, he's going to put out an edict for all the male babies to be killed. And so the Hebrew or the midwives don't. They preserve life and they end up acting contrary to the way that they were commissioned to act. And that's the first of it. And then eventually we get Moses in a basket in the Nile. Again, Pharaoh has said, throw all your babies into the Nile, and it's going to be his own daughter who's going to emerge and undermine his edict by preserving and pulling particularly Moses out of the water. And so one of the things we see through the women as we kind of walk through this is Moses is going to be God's appointed deliverer for the nation of Israel, but the deliverer himself needs deliverance at every turn. So it's the midwives, it's Pharaoh's daughter, it's Moses' sister who's tracing out along the Nile as Pharaoh's daughter pulls him out and then engages with Pharaoh's daughter, which would have been probably pretty scary. and then sets up for Moses' mom to nurse him, take care of him before eventually Moses will grow up in Pharaoh's house at a young age. And so you see that. And then eventually we get, as Moses escapes, and it's going to be his wife Zipporah who's going to have to engage because God is about to come for Moses' life because he hasn't circumcised his son. And so the deliverer has acted in a way where even God is saying there's going to be consequences, and it's going to be his wife, who's not a Hebrew, who's going to have to engage to ensure that Moses can be delivered from his own decisions at times.
Yeah, so good. I think that question definitely will have a lot of rich conversation in your groups. So then question 2, we have, so how does God then begin to prepare Moses as a leader, even in these chapters where we see him failing and we see him running and we see him going into the desert of Midian and into isolation? So we think that question 2 kind of centers around chapter 2, verses 11 through 22, if that kind of gives you a little bit of a handle on how to approach this question. But we see, Moses growing up, and he's got this kind of dual identity. He's in two cultures, if you will. He's a prince of Egypt. He's been raised in Pharaoh's house, but he's also knows, clearly we see this in the text, that he is a Hebrew. So he goes and he is visiting and looking at what's happening with his people, the Hebrews, and he interacts in a couple of ways. So he sees one being beaten, and he ends up killing the Egyptian, and the next day coming back and then interacting with a couple of more Hebrew men, and they in a sense reject him and call him out on what he has done, which then causes fear in him. And so Moses, to me, is just in this, who am I? What is my role? What is my place? And then because of this murder that happens, Pharaoh finds out about it and is seeking to kill Moses. So he runs and hides. So we've got failure and then running and getting into isolation. So I think the way that we were talking about it is that, actually in all the circumstances of our lives, through our own decisions, through things that happen to us that are outside of our control, God is using them to shape and to guide us and to help us understand who we are and how he can use us. So the cross-reference here is interesting. It's Hebrews 11, and that is actually the skill, if you'll notice in the interpretation section. It's a great one to say, hey, where else is this story talked about? And I would, if I were you, have someone in your group read the Hebrews 11 cross-reference, because all these years later, it's a different interpretation looking back on the life of Moses. Of course, he's the iconic leader of the people of Israel. The story is part of their culture, but it gives you another point of view on what happened in Moses' life and how God used it eventually in the life of faith.
I think as we kind of look at Exodus and only have Exodus, it's just easy to see Moses' adversity, to see his insecurity, kind of see his failures. And then Hebrews will kind of show back with a bit more positive light of there's still faith in the midst of all of that.
Right.
That he's trying to work it out. And so God's working with him to develop him along the way.
Yeah.
Question 3, we kind of asked, what do we learn about God from how he reveals himself to Moses in this section? And so in chapters 3 and 4, at least for me, it's probably some of my favorite parts of the book and the story of Moses, of just kind of seeing him early on trying to grapple with the call that God has in his life. And so whether some of us have kids and kind of watching them in their own kind of struggle with identity and purpose, or whether we think back to even our own college years and kind of wrestling with who we are and what God has for us, to see Moses just in real time kind of working through those things as well is really fascinating. In chapter 3, verse 11, he will say to God, and we'll cover this a little bit in question 4, but he'll say, God, who am I? And then eventually, then he's going to ask God, well, and who are you again? And so this question kind of gets into God's answer back to Moses when Moses is asking God, who is he? When people ask me, who is this deliverer that sent you? And so there's a few things we just see, I think, that scream loudly from the story. The first is God reveals himself to Moses in a burning bush. So not a normal way, and we don't see this anywhere necessarily else, but I think one of the things you're going to see kind of is the irony of just as the bush is consumed, so in the midst of adversity, suffering, and heat, Israel won't be consumed, that God will preserve them through that because God is a preserver and he's raised up a deliverer for his people as well. The other thing I like out of this is, again, the fire itself, or even asking Moses to remove his sandal, was just a reminder that God is holy, that there is a distinction between God and humanity, that humanity is sinful and God is holy. Other thing I liked is just the repeated refrain of God referring to himself as the same God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so just the same God who made promises, the same God who will keep promises, that there's no difference in the God that Israel dealt with and the God they're dealing with today. There's a consistency of his character and his purpose. I thought through this section, you kind of see God's compassion for Israel in the midst of their suffering. That in the 400 years of slavery that's ensued, that will ensue, that God has not lost sight of his people. He didn't misplace them. He's not oblivious to what they're walking through, but there's a real compassion and heartbreak and even engagement, ultimately. The last thing we see here is, as he describes and titles himself, I am who I am, it harkens back to his holy name, Yahweh. But there's also a few pieces of this that I think are really significant. One is there's a sense of authority attached to that name. That this God is a God who has authority. He's also a God who's existed for all of eternity. That there's he's the same God because he's existed for all generations. But then lastly, and I think one of the most significant parts to this is that name also has an element of agency, that he's a God of action. He's not a God who's created and kind of then got bored and walked off, that he's intimately involved, aware of, and is about to do something about the circumstances that his people are in.
Yeah, so good, so good. That takes us kind of into question 4 as well, which I love to hear this interaction between Moses and God. I mean, this is just a mind blower when you think about Moses just coming back time after time. I think we counted like 5 times that he's objecting to the next thing God is telling him. And it just humanizes the Bible in such a way, because you can think of yourself in those situations. So I think this would be a great question. Again, you could divide it up, or you could just say, hey, let's go through this together. Let's look and find all the objections and then how God responds back to them. To him. Starting, it's really in the section of chapter 3, verse 10, all the way through 4:17. I think overall, what I see God doing is just meeting Moses right where he's at. He showing him that he understands these objections. He's not dismissing them. He's actually coming up with a response to each one. Trey and I were laughing, though. The last one, it finally says, and God's anger burned. Like he finally was, fed up in a way with these continual objections that Moses is bringing to him, and yet he still provides. So in the last one, of course, he's basically like, I'm out. I can't do it. We were struggling in a way to like, what is it that he's saying? I don't have the confidence. I just can't do it. Please send someone else. It's the final plea in a way. And so God steps in and says, fine, your brother can help you, but I'm not going to let you out. You're still going to perform the sign. So it's going to be a partnership of all 3 of us in this assignment.
It's so interesting as you kind of jump from question 4 to question 5, because you see the sustained patience with Moses in the midst of his objections, in the midst of his fears, in the midst of his hang-ups. You see a little bit of frustration finally in the last one, but then question 5 kind of takes us to the scene in which Moses hasn't circumcised his child. And God is coming to kill Moses because that was such a grievous misstep for Moses. And so, well, why was it a misstep? And why is God so angry? And one of the things that I think we kind of were talking through is, it seems that God is consistently gracious with insecurity, but not immorality. And there's a difference between those. And so particularly here, and obviously even the immorality that Moses had in murdering someone, that's withstandable. But particularly what's happening here with his uncircumcised child is, if we go back to Genesis 17, God made a series of promises to Abraham and marked circumcision as the sign of the covenant. And so particularly a parent would circumcise their child as a statement of faith in the promises that God had extended. So it was their way of saying, I'm in, I trust you, Lord. And particularly I'm in, and circumcision was meant to draw their attention to one day one will come forth from the seed of woman in the line of Abraham that will bring fulfillment to these promises. And so when someone didn't circumcise their child, it was their kind of way of just saying, I don't think I trust the Lord with this. And so this particular moment in which Moses hasn't circumcised his child was not just immorality, but it was an immorality that showed a complete lack of faith and the very promises that God was coming to fulfill to utilize Moses to bring deliverance for, which is why there's such a different response here.
Yeah, so good. All right, and the sum it up section, again, that's a tool for you to use. If you feel like your group has already kind of processed these things, you can definitely move on to the application. So what did you think about these reflection questions?
Yeah, my favorite is question 1. I think Moses is such a relatable character here. I literally was talking to my son the other day and was like, hey, he's 6th grade. I was like, hey, do you ever in situations where you're being called to lead or take responsibility or in a scary spot, do you doubt? Are you unsure of yourself? And he goes, no. I go, I don't get that, dude. Like, because at least for me, and maybe he's just so naive at this point in time, but at least for me, it just all along the way, wrestling with insecurity from middle school to high school to college, even young adulthood, and just kind of wrestling with who am I? And so Moses feels to me like such a relatable character, to see his doubts, to see his insecurities, and then to get this real-time interaction with God and him, and to see how God responds to him. And so I would just encourage you guys, in the midst of kind of a desire for some honesty and authenticity, give that question some time. Let people kind of put themselves in the story of what would it be like if you were Moses? How would you have responded? Would it have been like that? Do you think God would have responded to you that way, or would it have been different? And so how do you connect with that piece of the story? And so give your group some time in that space and let them kind of wrestle with, if they were Moses, what would that have been like?
Yeah, so good. And you as a leader, this may be a point where you step out and say first your own insecurities, lead in that way as well, in vulnerability and in honesty. And here we have our full application section where we're looking for principles and all of those things. And remember, question 5 is always the same, is basically what is the invitation that you hear God offering to you this week in light of everything that you've studied, that the group has talked about. And if there's something, just to write down and have your group, even if they haven't done that yet, just take a moment and say, you know what, in light of all that we've talked about, what I've studied, I really feel like this is my next step. This is what I want to do to embody what I've been learning here. The spiritual practice that we have is another one on prayer. So we kind of make the point that, this conversation that Moses is having with God, you could kind of look at it like it's prayer, because it is. That's what prayer is, a conversation with God. And so we put this practice in here because basically we just wanted to have a moment for a group leader and a group to just say, hey, how is my prayer life? How have I been speaking and communicating with God? And so there's just some basic ideas here. Again, the questions of when will I be praying? Where will I be praying? How long? What will I be praying about? Using the springboard of this narrative to just look into our own life on how we communicate with God. And once again, if you're a believer for many, many years, it's always good to just kind of get a reboot and a refresh on, spending time with God in a true conversation, which the last point here we have is that it is only a true conversation if there's listening and speaking. So having a little discussion about that is like actually listening for the Lord instead of just talking and saying, taking up all your prayer time by what you're saying. We think that this is an awesome lesson. It really pulls together the humanity of God's people, including ourselves. And we think it'll be a great discussion for y'all.
We're excited for you guys, and we'll see you guys next week.